Okay, we're good to go, Fred?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, sir. All right, well, we're here for the Life Finance Committee meeting. I have everyone noted down here who's in attendance, and I will, let's see, our start time is 5:07, and I will, Fred, Ryan's saying on the YouTube channel he's not seeing the meeting streaming.
There's usually a little bit of a delay. It just shows Fred's icon. It may catch up in a minute. There you go. It's going.
Okay, awesome. All right. Very good. Thank you. We're good to go. All right. Well, with that, Mr. Ruth, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Gaynor. I think when we last met, there were a couple of things that we had kind of left on the table. I think there was, really two main topics. Maybe the second one had a part A and a part B. The first was the board had asked us to look at the potential for a performance audit and whether we thought as a lay finance committee that whether that would be something we would recommend or not recommend. And I know the board's done some of its own work looking into whether a performance audit would be wise for the district. But I think that was topic one. And then topic two was we were looking at the 5-year forecast, and we were looking at whether there might be, we did our normal 5-year forecast review that we've done in the past with you. And then I think the open question was going to be whether we thought cuts were necessary and whether we thought, we would be recommending levels of cuts. We don't believe it's our mission to represent or to recommend specific cuts, but we were going to potentially give our opinion to the board on whether we thought, some options the board might have when it came to levels of cuts. And then I know it kind of as a subsidiary issue to that, obviously what type of levy cycle you're trying to be on, informs the question of what level of cuts you might need to have. So that's, I guess, what I would call issue 2B, which is really kind of wrapped into the level of cuts question. So I think we should go ahead and start with the performance audit topic. Scott, I guess I'd maybe ask you to summarize where we stand. I know that I watched the Board of Education meeting where you gave the presentation. I don't know if everyone in the committee has. Maybe you could summarize that, not recapitulate everything in it, but give a sense of what you informed the board, and then we can jump off from there.
Absolutely. So yes, there was the presentation that we did for the board on the performance audit, and all the documents that we provided for the board at the time are in board docs, and I think on also my email. But if you don't have them, then under board docs, under library, Life Finance Committee, you'll see them there.
Yep.
There was a PowerPoint presentation in there that kind of was the summary, or I guess the highlights of the presentation we gave to the board, which really just kind of tried to inform people what a performance audit is, how it differs from the annual financial audit that we have done every year, because there's some confusion about that, and are we audited, are we not? And then we talked a little bit about, we reviewed the performance audits that have been done recently, and took the last 10 and said, okay, so what are some common themes that we see? Each one of those audits is available out on the Auditor State's website. Anyone can go out and look at those. There's generally an executive summary that accompanies those, and you can see what kind of overarching recommendations they have. So we went through and looked at all of those summaries, tried to see what the common threads were, and so we lay those out in that presentation as well, which tend to be, you should subsidize your extracurriculars and athletics less. Generally there's some staffing reductions that are involved in some class size. I mean, the whole gist of the performance audit is that there are peer comparisons. Look at it. They designate your peers, they look at the peers and then they make these recommendations. Transportation seemed to be a general one that was seen. And so you see the kind of the 5 common threads there that we saw. We also, that very same day, and I think it was Jody who had mentioned to me and found out as she was doing some research and the independent research that they can speak to. Just looking at some of the comparisons, we had the CUP report that we put out there. We had our executive summary from our previous performance audit back in 1999. But there, Jody noted that when you look at the peer districts for any other district in the state, that there were many more. I think Jody, 12 is what seemed to be the average. But for us, there were far fewer. And so the question was why? So I posed that question to Aaron Roush at ODE. He's their director of budget. And, his response, which is also one of the attachments that I sent to you, the email that he sent back, saying that there just aren't, there's Liz, there just aren't that many districts that are comparable to Cleveland Heights University Heights in terms of the criteria they use. So
yeah, Scott, actually, I'm going to correct you on one thing. Most school districts had 20 peers. There were a handful that had between 12 and 15, and I believe there were only 6 that had less than 12, and we had the lowest. We only had 4.
Gotcha. Perfect. Yeah.
I could pull that back up. I have it somewhere.
Yeah, so you saw Aaron's response.
And what's really notable is, for example, in South Euclid, Lyndhurst, and we are one of their peers, for example. But when you look in ours, they're not listed as a peer for us. So somehow they think that, we're alike maybe in some ways, but certainly not enough to really refer to us as a peer.
So those were kind of the big, highlights in terms of, and again, discuss through some of the pros and cons in terms of the cost, in terms of what some of the recommendations, as one could assume, when you look through all the recent audits and you see those common threads, would be similar things that they would recommend for us. Also, Jody reached out to Talawanda, is the one district, or one of 2, I guess I should say, that actually requested an audit rather than have it being imposed upon him, because these performance audits are done. ODE and the auditor states say, we see you're in fiscal distress. You obviously need some help identifying some potential cuts. So we're going to come in and we're going to do this process and give you the results. Well, for Talawanda, we requested it. So Woody actually has a presentation that she wanted to do for the Lay Finance Committee tonight to kind of let you know what her conversations were with that district and what her findings were and kind of why they requested it and what their conclusions were. Should we go ahead and jump into Jody's?
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Actually, I'm here because Jim asked me to come. I had, at the board meeting, I had offered, I think I had said, hey, has anyone talked to the one district who actually requested a performance audit? And nobody had, so I made the offer to do that. So I am going to present. Let's make sure I do this correctly. And can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Oh, I got to hit the share button. There you go. Let's try this again. Now, can you see it?
There.
Yes.
Do you need me to make it bigger? I can put it in presentation view.
Can you do that, Jody?
Yes, that'll work. Thank you.
Okay. Does that work for everyone?
You want to go ahead and put it in presentation? I don't know how the charts get.
I did, but you guys don't see it in presentation mode?
No, it's probably in another window on your machine.
Okay, let me try this again. Sorry, I don't usually use Google Meets for this kind of stuff, so let's try again. Doesn't want to do that for me.
You know, Microsoft Office's presentation view does a lot of other things. It tries to keep the other piece open. Google may not. Yeah, Google may not see that.
Do that for me. Let me try again.
If you can only just display it in the native PowerPoint, I mean that can be good enough.
Yeah, that was certainly visible on my end.
Okay, let me try again. We'll do that again.
Jody, if you do entire, like, there you go. If you do entire screen, yeah.
If I do entire screen?
Yeah, you can go back and forth between any of your tabs.
This is good.
Was that good enough?
Yeah, it is good enough.
Yeah,
yeah, we can roll with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll go with this. And these are in the board doc, so if anybody wants it, it is there as well. So as I said, I had offered to go ahead and call down to Talawanda and just find out what their experience was. And first of all, why I picked Talawanda was there were only 2 districts in 25 that had requested a performance audit between 2018 and 2020. And meanwhile, while I was trying to connect with Talawanda, this other one had come out. So this Ripley Union Lewis Huntington Local School District, and theirs was a audit that the scope was limited to facilities only, though it wasn't a full audit. So Talawanda is the only school district that had requested a full audit within that time period. And Talawanda's came out on 3/26, so just as the pandemic, 3/26/20, so it was just as the pandemic was really starting to ramp up. So their analysis had been done prior to the pandemic. And then the Ripley Union Lewis Huntington, this audit was actually conducted between May of 2020 and August of 2020, but it wasn't released until March of 2021. You can see it was actually released on March 2nd, so that's why I didn't see it originally. But it did include this note that pretty much says that, due to the pandemic, that there were some analysis that they kind of had to work around with the pandemic information. So it's just kind of a warning, like, hey, that all of the analysis was done prior to the pandemic. So who is Talawanda? I thought I'd start with that because it was a school district I was not familiar with, but it's located in Southwest Ohio. It's mostly rural. It's around the city of Oxford, so that's where Miami University is located. The total population of the area is nearly 30,000 people, and the district serves just over 3,000 students. It's between Cincinnati and Dayton, and their student poverty rate is lower than ours. It was roughly 30%. And so the first question I asked was why? Why did you want to? Why did you make this why did you request this performance audit? And they said because their district is spending more annually than it brings in from tax revenue. They're not classified in fiscal distress yet, but they will be in a few years if they do not pass a levy. So the 2 people I spoke with their superintendent, Dr. Ed Thoreau, and their board president, Chris Otto. I can say that one of the things that I have enjoyed most about being in this role on the board is getting to reach out to other school districts. We had very interesting conversations about performance audits and just about the state of education in general, ed choice, a lot of other interesting topics came up. So it was just, I'm really appreciative of the fact that I did have the opportunity to reach out to them and get to know a couple of other public school supporters across the state. So their rationale for their requesting of a performance audit was, yes, they're not in fiscal distress yet, but they wanted to be proactive. And they thought the audit would give them, you know, a fresh set of eyes on their finances and on how they were running their district before they asked the community for a levy. Their audit cost $60,000, and the cost is based on the size of the district. So how they were compared, this was pretty interesting. They said that their audit looked at neighboring school districts, and they said they're often compared to those neighbors, but their neighbors are not in their comparable group. So once again, you know, their neighbors aren't necessarily their peers. And if you looked at that map I showed you, you can see that there were some, you know, larger districts or more urban districts, as well as, you know, they're kind of a rural district. They were also compared to a couple of different groups. There was some primary peers, there were some local peers, there were university peers because they're a university town, and there were some transportation peers based on how they, the auditors looked at their transportation situation. The thing that they were concerned about was that the audit, when it looked at their comparable peers, it eliminated any comparable district who spent the same amount or more money than their district. So that it was really only looking at districts that spent less than theirs. And that was a concern to them. Also because they said it didn't look at any other measure of, it didn't look at any quality of education kind of measure. There was nothing, you know, no look at test scores, at, you know, prepared for success, at grades, at, there was no kind of quality measure. It was just about the money. So some of their direct comments were, they said it was like a race to the bottom. So you're only looking at who are doing things cheaper or for less money, not necessarily who's doing things better. There was no consideration of the impact of the quality of the education or how these cuts would affect that. They were also frustrated in that they felt that the audit gave them very simple answers, but it didn't tell them how to do it. And one of the examples they gave was the audit had recommended they negotiate more favorable contracts with busing companies. In their district, because it's rural, they outsourced their busing, and they said there's really only 3 companies around that will even take on that contract. And but there was, you know, no additional help or suggestions on how would you go about negotiating a favorable contract, or even if that was possible. They were concerned because they felt that their audit, you know, it didn't compare them to any other district who was doing the same or better on whether it was the state report card, on tests, on any quality measure, and it was purely a dollars and cents analysis. They were also concerned because some of the cuts that were recommended would have cut support for items that are measured on the state report card. And there were some recommended cuts to things that were out of the district's control. And the bottom line, they said, was they did not feel it was worth the $60,000 that they spent on the audit. They did say that the audit gave us some information but it was information on things that their own team had already identified as areas for savings. You know, things like, you know, negotiate a different contract with their union, or there's an analysis in here or in their audit about custodial services. They said that it did not, when they were doing their own analysis of things that they thought they would cut, there were some things that they did not consider because they knew it would be a race to the bottom, and it was some things that they said would not go over well with their community, and they knew would not provide a high quality education. For example, they made they talked about how they're a university town. A lot of professors at Miami University live in their community and expect certain things, you know, that the community expects to have advanced placement courses. It expects to have a gifted program. So some of the recommendations that were in the audit were, number one, eliminate all AP classes. And as part of that was also eliminate the instructors who teach them. There was a recommendation to eliminate all test prep. So all preparation they are doing to help their students for ACT and SAT testing which they felt if they eliminated that test prep, it would impact their prepared for success measure on the state report card. There was also a recommendation to eliminate all gifted services. And that's another thing that they felt was an important measure on the state report card and a measure that they do pretty well on. There was a recommendation to implement pay to play for sports. And they said their community would be against this because of the roughly 30% of their employee or their student population that is poverty, on the poverty line. And they were worried that, that would not, that those students would not be able to participate. There was a recommendation to increase the gate fees for sporting events. And the district was concerned because they don't set those gate fees, the league that they belong to does. And when they asked about this, the auditor's viewpoint was, well, you can advocate for the league to raise those fees. Some of the other recommendations were things like eliminate half of a position or a quarter of a position, and then they'd add up, these percentages or whatever, these parts of a position. And in Talawanda, they said that that was not realistic to cut half or a quarter of a person because there's specific certifications that are required to do certain roles or to teach certain courses. So, how do you cut a third of a person, or how do you cut a half of a person? They said there was also some challenges with how items are coded. So they said sometimes the auditors had issues comparing some similar categories. So sometimes they were comparing things that weren't like, so it was, some guesswork, and that some of that wasn't accurate. And then they also had concerns about their audit because they really felt it only focused on the negatives. They said there were some things that they were, doing better, their district was more favorable, and it wasn't even mentioned in the audit. For example, their administrative salaries are lower than some of the peers they were compared against, but that information wasn't even included in the audit. They really went into it with the thought that the audit would be a way to help their community understand their financial challenges, but they said instead it ended up being very divisive for their community. They said some community members wanted to follow the recommendations exactly. They didn't understand what the cuts would mean or how their quality of education would be impacted. And they really doubted, because of the timing of their audit being right before the pandemic, how useful the information would be post-pandemic, because the analysis didn't consider any of the additional costs that would be resulting from the pandemic. They did say there were some things that went well. The things that went well, they said the auditors were very nice. They were very professional while they were there. And they did a very helpful analysis for Talawanda on a specific issue. And this is the issue of the district of Talawanda currently partially outsources its custodial services. And they specifically asked for a cost analysis of what it would be to fully outsource that, whether they should continue their partial outsourcing or bring that fully in-house. And they said that analysis was really helpful, and they did use that to help inform their decision about what to do with custodial services going forward. Some of the recommendations they had for me if we decided to go forward with a performance audit was, they said if you have a specific area that you need a cost analysis performed on, then they would recommend narrowing the scope and requesting a performance audit on that area. They said make sure that if we did one, we went into it knowing that it's a cost-cutting exercise and not any kind of educational performance analysis. And they said be very aware that there will be lots of recommendations to cut things that will probably impact the quality of the education that you're able to provide. They said expect simple recommendations without details on how to execute on them, and expect that it would be very divisive for the community. They said, expect to have to do a lot of communication around the results to help the community understand the impacts that the recommended cuts would have on the quality of education. They also said expect that many of the recommended cuts would not align with the quality of education, the expectations the community has for our district, and expect that some of the recommendations, if implemented, would negatively impact the grade on the state report card. I did share this presentation with them before I brought it to you because I wanted to make sure that I didn't misrepresent any of the information that they gave me. They read through it, and they said no, they did give a couple of suggestions on the peer groups and explaining that, but the rest of the presentation, they said yeah, that I captured their thoughts as they intended me to have them. So I, present that to you, and I just ask if you have any questions based on the information that they gave me and that I was able to share.
Jody, it sounds like these performance audits are almost always brought by districts that, as Scott indicated, they're almost always required. And you can understand that if there's a district that's going to be out of money in a year or two, and you have to find some cuts, then you just find some cuts, and that's kind of the purpose of the performance audit most of the time. Mm-hmm. In Talawanda's situation, they maybe didn't have to find some cuts. Does the auditor? Did you get any sense from speaking to them that the auditor takes a different approach in a Talawanda situation, or does the auditor just kind of have the mindset that when you do a performance audit, you have to find cuts? I mean, did you get any sense of that?
Well, I mean, what they told me, what Chris and Ed told me was they said that it's merely a cost cutting exercise. They said that is what the purpose of the performance audit was. And they were looking for, they're not in fiscal distress yet, but they know they're going to be in a couple of years. They're in deficit spending. They cannot continue, to do that long term. That they're spending more than they're bringing in tax revenue. So they know they're going to have to ask their community for a levy, or they're going to have to make significant cuts at some point. And as we've all seen, if you make cuts earlier, you can extend that levy cycle out, which is, what they were looking for. But I didn't get the sense from them that there was any different methodology used because they were requesting it versus it being one that was being imposed on a district based on its 5-year forecast. But they did say that they felt that you could go through any cost-cutting exercise of, which many of us have had to do because of our roles in our day jobs, right? You take a look at your budget and where are you going to cut? Or, what's the number you're trying to get at and how are you going to get there? They said that they thought that would have been just as effective to do an exercise that way instead of spending the $60,000 to get information they pretty much already knew.
I see Adam has a hand up there.
Jody and Jim, do you guys anticipate that if we did the audit that we would pretty much get the same recommendations, gut AP, gut gifted, raise ticket prices, pay to play sports? Like, is there some other magic pot of cuts that this auditor would come up with? And are these people state employees? Are they consultants that the state recommends?
They're state employees that work for the auditor's office. So, and I forgot, what was the first part of your question?
Just like, I mean, that set of recommendations from Talawanda, right? Like, we're not going to gut AP, right? Like, we're not going to like, are there some other, is it sort of a standard set of recommendations that they're going to come with? Like, or is there some unique thing that they're going to come with for us?
No, I think it's a standard set of recommendations. I know like one of the things that they had recommended in the Talawanda audit was negotiate a different dental contract with your employees. Like the dental insurance they thought was out of line compared to other school districts in Talawanda. And I know that when I looked at several of these audits, there were similar themes that you see over and over and over again. I mean, they're always saying negotiate different contracts with your unions. Closed buildings, that's always one that tends to rise up. Talawanda had a little bit of a unique situation in that, they had this outsourced busing that they were already doing and this partially outsourced custodial work. So that gave some opportunity for maybe a little bit different analysis or a little deeper analysis in specific areas. But all the ones that I've looked at, I think you can pull out common themes.
So Scott actually did some of that in his presentation to the board. And I'm looking at slide 7 of his board presentation. And there's really 5 items, but 10 out of the 10 last performance audit, they said decreased support for extracurriculars. Another 10 out of 10 of the last 10 audits, staff reductions, administrators, social workers, counselors, psychologists, aides, teachers. 9 out of 10 of the last audits, employee insurance benefit reductions, which we did in our last round of negotiations. Again, 9 out of 10 negotiated contract changes, and then 10 out of 10 transportation. Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Reductions. So these are sort of like the common themes that we've seen. If we were to engage in this, it's likely that this is exactly what we would see on our end. So.
I mean, now that said, I do think we need to be taking, look at things. I do think that we need to be comparing ourselves to others and figuring out, what things we might want to adjust. And we definitely need to get our cost structure changed. I mean, and to kind of make a statement on Ryan's first statement opening the meeting is, I personally would love to see us get to a 5-year levy cycle. I think the 3-year levy cycle is just really difficult for our community. But I don't think just taking a cookie cutter approach to cuts across the board is the way to do it. I mean, I think that you have to be very strategic about how you do it. I think there's certain things that, we should be looking at. I don't think that getting, a standard, do these things when, okay, we've already seen from the slide that Ryan was just showing, those are things that we should go look at, but not necessarily pay, I think the estimate for our district was somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000. I mean, the conversation I had with Talawanda was they both the board president and the superintendent said they could have used that $60,000 in other ways and still, came up with areas that they could decide on their own to cut.
I guess my take on that is if that's 60,000, or I think it would be 80,000 for us, if I remember right, Scott.
Yes.
So, for us, that cost would be 80,000. The 80,000 doesn't scare me if it solved our problem of eliminating school levies. But the only way we're going to eliminate school levies is if we sort of gut the school district. And, people are going to argue whether this is a high quality school district or a school district that you sort of rate based on the report card. And I'm going to go with the former. I mean, our school district is a high quality school district. We have people that are choosing to go here, even when they have options to go to Ed Choice. Kids that are walking out here with excellent results. We know the report cards aren't inaccurate. We hear people in Columbus from both political parties that repeat, and Adam, I think you've had videos that basically say the report cards don't indicate truly what's going on in your school district. And we know, I think everybody here at this table, I'm preaching to the choir if anybody, I think we all agree with that. But the deal here is if this was a silver bullet that was going to spare us from having to do school levies, I'd spend that $80,000 in a heartbeat. But the more and more we dig into this, I think we're finding that the concept of a performance audit is just a cost-cutting exercise with no regard to really how well the school district is actually performing from an educational perspective. And as a school board member, in the spirit of transparency, I would like to have outsiders look at us and judge us and help us from a report card perspective, maybe our own report card perspective, show us how we do perform financially against other school districts. I know when we were working with our unions on our last set of negotiated contracts, we had all the data from all the other school districts, and we were using that in all our decisions. And as everybody knows, we made some very, very difficult decisions. Some of them were wildly unpopular. Some of them were very popular. But it helped us get more aligned with what other school districts are doing. And I think that would be part of a conversation I'd love to have, I think, after we sort of amongst ourselves, talk a little bit more about the performance audits. I see a bunch of people have their hands raised, so I'm going to just mute and let Ryan continue with this meeting.
Yeah, Ryan, I see. So Kathy had hers up, and then Adam and Max. One real quickly before Kathy speaks, I just want to mention that we have engaged, and Liz could speak to this if we need to. With the U.S. Department of Education, we volunteered for a study that they're doing, and we're either one or two. I've seen it two different ways at schools in the state of Ohio, but really it's to look at per pupil spending by building and to do an analysis on how to determine, whether or not that spending is equitable in terms of outcomes. It's more of an outcome driven analysis, and it's more of an equity analysis, and kind of visualizing those data points and then communicating them out to the community and to stakeholders. So, that's kind of one piece of an overall analysis that we have engaged in just recently. And I know that's going to be going on for the next couple of months.
You partially answered my question. I wanted to say that from my own years of experience in reviewing, working with school districts, not just on financing transactions and where performance audits would come up and there would be opportunities to review them. I really am not aware of any instance where anybody felt that it was particularly helpful, and for all of the reasons that you're describing. And so are there private sector alternatives to the state auditor's office that you've heard of, that other school districts have used in order to get the type of analysis that you were just talking about, Scott? Not exactly that type of analysis, because I do think that it's probably possible to look at an array of things, not all of which necessarily go to outcomes and equity. There could be some things that, where what one could really be looking at it simply from a business standpoint, that and taking into account, of course, that would have an impact on the educational outcomes and experience, but that wouldn't be exactly what's driving it. It's more looking at staffing from a qualitative standpoint more than from a quantitative standpoint.
So that is a good question. I think that's probably one we'd have to pose to our peer districts. We could do a survey even of the first ring to see if people know of those kinds of third parties that can do some of those things. I've heard personally of some vendors who will come in and say they would look at specific parts of your organization. So, as Jody mentioned, outsourcing of custodial staff, or, we were approached often by a third party who will come in and say, we'll look at whether or not offering some kind of an early retirement incentive would be beneficial. So they're kind of a piecemeal approach for some of those things. Whether or not, as well, we could absolutely Jim check with them as well. So I think there are vendors who do at least some specific kinds of analyses that way that we could talk to. Certainly, we were excited about the Department of Education piece that just came, because it really is an attempt to try to tie some of the spending to equity and to outcomes, which is kind of aligned with our strategic plan. So, that was a good thing, but that's a good point, Kathy. We can definitely look into that further. I see Liz wanted to comment there.
Yeah, we were doing some investigation of working with our, there's a organization called Schoolhouse Partners that we've been working with on the post-secondary platform that we've started to slowly roll out in the district. They also have an arm in the company that does some strategic budgeting work for districts. They've done some larger districts. Now the price tag is actually more expensive than the performance audit, And so once I saw the price tag, especially this year, I said, well, let's just kind of hold this and see perhaps if we can get a funder to pay for this for us, maybe apply for a grant or something like that. So I think when you do a really thorough process, it's not, certainly it's not cheap. We like the one that we're in right now because it does come at no cost because, we're kind of one of the first couple of districts in, and they're using us to see, how they can make it useful for districts. So.
I think Max.
Yeah, so I'm curious, we're having this kind of long discussion about performance audits, and I think the presentation from the other school district was really helpful, Jody. I thought that was really, that was very informative. And sort of convinces me that it's not really, it doesn't seem to be worth it. It's $60,000 or $80,000 that, what are they going to tell us? And I guess what I'm thinking then too is like the people in these sort of reactionary online groups like on Nextdoor and things like that who are talking about this, who are like demanding that there be this performance audit. Like are we, I understand like an audit is always a good idea, right? Like look under the hood and make sure your operations are running smoothly and efficiently, but are we doing this just to appease them? And if that's the case, is it going to? Are they gonna vote for a levy then because we all of a sudden said, okay, yeah, we're gonna invite a performance audit. The auditor is going to come in, say that we need to make all these horrendous cuts that nobody wants to make. We're not going to make them, and then we have to go back on the ballot anyway. So it seems like I don't know. That's my analysis, like thinking down the road. But I'd love to get on a 5-year levy cycle, but until there's some huge legislative shift at the state level, like I don't see that happening unless voters are going to vote for an enormous levy that'll get us through 5 years. That then we're going to have to repeat every 5 years as well. So I don't know. It's sort of like it's really stuck between a rock and a hard place. But that's just kind of what I'm thinking on this performance audit bit.
Well, let me summarize where I think we're at, and if somebody wants to continue talking about the performance audit, we can. But what I've kind of heard is that really this is a tool for struggling districts, and it's a cost-cutting exercise, like Jody said. So they're not going to cut. They never come in and say, "Oh, no, everything looks about right." They're looking to find cuts, and the way they do that is they choose peers, and they compare you to those peers. And so really, the audit comes down to an exercise of, do you really believe the peers they've chosen for you are appropriate? And I think what we learned from Jim and Jody both in the prior board meeting or work session or whatever it was, is that we strongly suspect that the peers they're going to, we all know that Cleveland Heights University Heights is relatively unique. And our gut that we're pretty unique is really shown by the data, that where even the state says, yeah, you are maybe the most unique school district in the state, in that we think you have very few peers. And even the school districts that we say are your peers, you're not their peers. You're the districts that are most similar to you, we don't really even think are that similar to you when you look at it the other way around. So if they're just going to come in and compare us to peers that aren't really our peers, then we're really not going to believe in the results, because they're not going to be worthwhile. So with that said, if you only have one tool, you use it. So the question becomes, what other tools do we have to find places, to cut costs? What other tools do we have to benchmark our costs? It's always difficult being on this committee, because you see line items and you can compare it to some other school districts, and this line item might be a little higher, this one might be a little lower, and sometimes there's good reasons for that, but it's very difficult to understand kind of the rationale in each instance. And I do think one useful thing for this committee to perhaps do is to start to kind of, go through certain things, and it wouldn't be kind of we're not going to be a group of performance auditors, but, just ask, certain line items we could focus on in different meetings to just understand a little better how we compare to other districts, And maybe there's situations where, you know, that means that Scott or Liz might want to look at bringing in somebody to look at a specific area. You know, like we kind of got a lot of input on the healthcare area last time around. But I do think it is maybe a role for this committee to look for, you know, look for areas that we have questions about as members of the community. And maybe it's something that Scott and Liz feel like they can handle in-house, and maybe it's things that they feel maybe we should take a closer look. So I guess that's where I'm at. Kathy?
Again, you're touching on just at the end there on what I was going to ask about, and that is, doesn't the administration get together and confer about how you could do things differently and how you could do things less expensively? I would assume that is part of the process. And do you feel that that's really the best way of identifying where cuts could be made based on, you know, what seems to be value added, what doesn't seem to be value added, you know, and other kinds of measures that sort of get to that, answering that question?
Liz, do you want to jump on there, or you want me to? I mean, I guess my answer to that question would be, I feel like we had just one of those meetings this morning. So Liz and I and Paul and Felicia had a conversation about, you know, we're talking about cuts for next year. We're talking about the number of retirements we had, trying to continue to streamline the organization through attrition, and also see if there's a way to redeploy some of those folks for you know, different things or different needs that the ed's identified. So yes, those kinds of conversations are happening every year as we look at what the programming needs are. And so yeah, it kind of segues into the second conversation in terms of, you know, budget reductions and those kinds of things. But Liz, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add there.
Yeah, and one thing we've been doing is benchmarking some of our structures against peer districts too. So in some ways, what the performance audit says it would do, except we use our actual peer districts. And so I've been in conversations with superintendents, looking at some of the structures they have, you know, in their districts tied to specific strategic goals, just to see, you know, is what we have in place, is this similar? Have districts found it to be useful? Are there ways, to Scott's point, that we can streamline as well? So we are aligning, and let's move to the next conversation, you know, we're aligning our budget to the strategic priorities that, you know, we'll be focusing on for the next 5 years, which will mean some things are likely to shift around, likely to be eliminated, likely to be added though as well. So, but always keeping an eye on cost and efficiency while also implementing, you know, strategy too for the district.
Well, and I would just add to that you know, good thing with us doing that and Liz having those conversations with First Ring, you know, and with the First Ring treasurers, is that we can actually do that deeper dive. And we try to hammer home this point during levy times when people are looking at just a straight up spending per pupil comparison and saying, why is yours so much in this district and that district? And, you know, we talk about how it's never an apples to apples comparison. You know, that there are things that drive those costs in different ways. And so even like special ed, you know, we got into that whole mess where, oh, well, you know, ODE, the CUP report spending per pupil is X, but the ODE report card is Y. They normalize based on, you know, district special ed populations. And even within those special ed populations, you know, depending on the severity of the disabilities of your students and how many you have, that can affect how much money you need. And so you have to kind of get into the weeds with some of your peers and say, okay, now that we see this difference, why is that? And often there are, as Ryan said, reasons for that. And sometimes there aren't. And that's where we need to make. So I think that's kind of an ongoing process.
Well, I guess I'd like to simply, you know, ask if anybody thinks that this committee should be recommending a performance audit to the board, because I get the sense that nobody would, but I want to put the question out there.
My answer is no.
My answer is no as well. It almost seems like you might be able to get a statement from the auditor's office that this district is so unique that they aren't really able to do the same type of comparisons that they normally do in a performance audit. I mean, they might acknowledge the difficulty in serving a district like ours in that way.
I don't see the value in spending $80,000 on it, especially because I feel like the portion of the voters in Cleveland Heights that really want one have already done that audit in their minds anyway, right? Like Jody and Jim, are you hearing anything? What are you hearing from people generally when they advocate for this? Haven't they already made up their minds about what they want to cut, or they really just are general advocates? I feel like most people already have an idea of what they think they should cut. The people that really want this performance audit.
Well,
yeah, I think the question is like, so if we do a performance audit and don't change anything, or just do the changes that we're thinking about doing anyway, like, is a huge swath of voters going to be like, oh, thank God you did that performance audit. That's really what I cared about, and I'm going to vote for whatever levy you put on the ballot? Probably not.
It's my experience when you talk to a person that knows and understands the schools, when they hear the performance audit and we don't have one, it's almost like a Cleveland Heights person saying, what, you don't have a mayor? You can't possibly have a city without a mayor. But the reality is you have leadership already that is different leadership. It's just not what you would think is the leadership. I mean, we already have a lot of fiscal controls that the state puts us under. We're already audited. But when people think of the performance audit, it's like people say, I voted for the school levy, even though that, you're not audited. And it's like, well, what do you mean we're not audited? Well, you didn't do that performance audit. And they go, well, we are audited by the state. And that is a really comprehensive audit. So I think I think there's that issue that people just really don't get. As a person in a leadership role here, if the performance audit's going to help us, we need to do it. But I don't see where it's going to help us. But I see there's things that happen in a performance audit that could be helpful. It's like all our analysis on the healthcare that's going on, and possibly what's happening with this new program that we're part of with the government, the federal government that Scott was speaking about it, where they're comparing our cost structure by buildings. I also see us, implementing more measures in our strategic plan that are fiscal based and measure us against peers. And I think that is maybe something that I think the community would be able to better understand. So I'd like to, and I know that's still in flux, but I think this committee can play a role when we really start putting those measures out and looking at those measures, looking at some of the costs associated with those measures. I think that would be a really valuable piece for this. I think that would be a good thing for this committee to evaluate. So,
well, let me suggest we close out this first topic. That we are an hour in. I think you've heard from the Lay Finance Committee that none of us are recommending a performance audit to the board for the reasons we've discussed. I do agree with Jim, and I think Scott, is suggesting by his head nods every once in a while that there's probably more work for this committee to do, and I think it's maybe up to the board to give us specific direction on areas they think we could be helpful in. And I think, I could have conversations offline with Scott as well to maybe identify areas where we could be useful. But let's maybe move on to the second agenda item for the meeting. And I think, when we were last here in early February, we were talking about, possible cut recommendations and levels of cut recommendations. And I know that just in recent weeks, a lot of the information that was in the 5-year forecast may be shifting. So I'll turn it over to Scott to just give us a high level update as to kind of what's going on with the overall fiscal situation, not in any detail, but at a high level.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. And you're absolutely right. I do agree that, we can definitely determine more things for the committee to look at. There's always appreciate the eyes on anything like that. In terms of the 5-year forecast and the level of cuts, so you'll remember, I think the last time we spoke, we had some level of state cuts that were returned to the district, about half. We had an additional, a third workers' comp refund. So a lot of positive movement on the bottom line. Thing that happened that I'd mentioned to Ryan yesterday is that we got our final tax settlement in for the property taxes. And so that's one of the reasons that we set this meeting later this month, so that we'd have that. So remember that the county came in and said that we should put an estimate in based on 89% collection of property taxes, and the committee rightfully decided that we should really take a 5-year average of collections rather than use that reduced amount for next year, or for this year, I should say. Well, the final numbers have come in, and we've even exceeded using a 5-year average. So property tax collections pretty much remain the same as they were last year, and then with the levy in addition to that. So we actually ended up about $2 million ahead of where we would have expected in property tax collections this year, based on the 5-year average. So that's also something that I think we could anticipate moving forward. Certainly if there wasn't an issue with COVID or any other issues with collection for the last calendar year, that we would expect, we'd see similar collections for future years. So that's going to definitely positively impact the bottom line, and again, kind of stretch things out, as Jody had indicated. Also, in terms of the cut conversations, as I mentioned, we've continued to try to identify some staffing reductions. We had a lot of retirements, probably COVID related. People just finally said, you know what, yeah, I'm done with this. So, a decent number of teacher retirements. So that's one of the things that we've been looking at. Again, can we, through attrition, make some reductions in staffing that way and achieve some level, even if it's not the $2 million that was previously embedded in the forecast, but what does that number look like? And then also, one of the biggest things, and probably many of you have heard about this, is this federal stimulus money that they continue to give to governmental entities. So we had the ESSER 1 money that we got back early in the year. That was about $1.2 million. We used that to supplant and offset the state cuts that we had at that time. There's an ESSER 2 round of money that I spoke with Super RD actually today. They think that amount of money is going to be available through the CCIP, through ODE. That's how we access federal funds. Probably as soon as June, but definitely by July 1. That's going to be $7.6 million that the district is going to receive. And pretty broad use, again, like ESSER 1, we were allowed to, you can use it for PPE purchases, for technology, for anything you need that's kind of COVID related. That's really the intent. But also, if you continue operations in a COVID environment and continue to offer service to students and you don't lay off staff, then that's one of the things you can use the money for and kind of supplement in your general fund. So that's what we did with the first round. The second round, $7.6 million. So we can, do some of that as well with the 7.6. Now, President Biden has this third round of stimulus dollars. It's supposed to be made available next year to be spent by 2024. And that ESSER 3 money, ODE is estimating at 2.4 times what ESSER 2 was. So that could be upwards of $18 million for the district. The only thing is there are some additional restrictions with that money. 20% of it must be spent for summer remediation and tutoring and kind of, getting students back up to speed. A lot of that will have some of the same uses as the previous ESSER money. So that's still not determined yet, but that's what some preliminary estimates that we've seen through meetings with the first ring treasurers and superintendents and with ODE that they're suggesting. So lots of good stuff happens of additional revenues coming into the district that I think are going to help us in the long run, trying to stretch those levy dollars out, as Jody had said. So that's kind of some of the high level things that have happened at this point. And yeah, again, the stimulus dollars, it's someone actually referenced it as like districts are getting a tsunami of money. And I don't know if I describe it quite that way, but it certainly is significant. And it's and I think for us, it's helpful that we not only access that money, but we access some additional kinds of monies to do some of those COVID-related things. Like, for example, there was a broadband connectivity grant that we accessed and used to buy hotspots for families. Because we already had Chromebooks for students, so we didn't really need to buy those, but we did need hotspots, so we found that grant to do that. There was some CARES money that came that was specifically designated for PPE. We used that to buy, the shields for the desk, hand sanitizer, and a lot of those kinds of things. So, we've been trying to grab every pot of money we can for different purposes in different ways. So this is just additional money that we're seeing now that I'm hopeful that it comes through. Columbus made a little bit that they're concerned about how this is going to affect the free school funding plan, and whether or not, the legislature is going to see, this federal stimulus money, even though it's one time coming in, might do something different with the free school funding plan or with state funding. But as Ryan pointed out in our conversation, Columbus is getting this money too, and so certainly they have their own pot of money to distribute as well. So more to come on that. We'll know the biennial budget in June. We'll know where that stands and what that looks like. Everything definitely at this point seems to be moving.
Scott, when would we see, or what's the status of, I guess, an updated 5-year forecast that incorporates some of these items? Can you give us kind of an update on your timeline there, so we would understand when we get the new picture now that quite a bit has changed?
Yeah, I think that so the last forecast in March had what I would say everything we know up to that point, other than the property tax settlements. So the 5-year forecast that we present to the board in April will have final numbers for the property tax settlement and that moving forward, and to the late finance committee of that as soon as we incorporate those numbers. ESSER money, until that's confirmed, like the 7.6 is, I would say, pretty certain, but that's not available and accessible to us yet, so it's not in the forecast. Once we have that available, we'll put that in. But even then, we're not quite sure what that, what we're spending it on or what that looks like. So how that would play in the 5-year forecast is still a little undecided. And then the ESSER 3, probably next year when we get that in. The June forecast will have any of the changes that we know of, and then 4th July we'll have the final expenditures for this year. So your forecast in a couple of weeks that will have the property tax changes and how that impacts the bottom line. But what I can tell you is, if you look at the best and you anticipate an additional $2 million in fiscal 21 forward, that starts bringing that fiscal 24 number positive, closer to positive.
Well, if the 2 million in cuts are made.
If the 2 million in cuts are made, correct. Yes. If it goes down from that, then you're right. Then that could affect that, differently. Although I will say the conversations we had, and again, the number of retirements and the way that Liz and the Ed Services team are kind of suggesting, on meeting the needs of students. I think the cuts, although it may not be at a $2 million level, pretty significant.
So are you saying, Scott, that the administration has already identified cuts, in some general ballpark that you're comfortable with recommending? Or you broke up a little bit in that last comment. I want to make sure I understood it.
Oh, sorry. I would just say that we have a number of reductions that we're prepared to talk to the board about at the retreat on Saturday, and I feel like based on at least some preliminary numbers, it looks to be substantive. It's we're not talking about $250,000 or $500,000. It's significant. Liz, would you agree with that?
Yes. Substantive cuts.
But again, largely attrition and just trying to streamline the organization, and again, in conjunction with these comparisons, with looking at what we need to provide or what we can provide, but that this isn't necessarily riffing a bunch of staff people. This is more, okay, we have a bunch of retirements. We have some people leaving the organization. Can we redistribute that work? Can we do that work differently? And I think that's going to result in some significant savings, because that's the moving forward.
Well, let me just comment on how I think that maybe changes our committee's role, and then maybe I'd invite the other committee members to weigh in. When we were meeting in early February, we were facing a situation where we were going to be at a zero cash balance, really at the end of fiscal 23. It wasn't far out. It was right around the corner. And so I think we felt, that in our role, it was pretty obvious that whether or not we liked it or not, the only fiscally prudent thing to do would be to make some level of cuts. And what we were going to be discussing was, how what types of recommendations we might make as far as size and timing. And there might have been some recommendations to be made. This, honestly just complicates things quite a bit. It makes the situation a little less clear. And it stops to necessarily become an obvious fiscal decision and more of a honest, not to pass the buck, but it starts to become more of a board level decision as far as extending levy cycles, and do we want to still cut so we can make it in X number of years. And the other problem that we have is we know the property tax number goes up, but with the amount, right now Scott is estimating what we're going to get from the state of Ohio. That estimate, before we thought, well, he's splitting the difference between 2 years ago and last year, which seemed reasonable to me. Maybe there's reason to be optimistic on that number. I don't know. But it makes things a lot less clear, and it makes me less comfortable making a decisive recommendation to the board. I think it would be a shame if anybody interpreted this to mean we shouldn't be making cuts. I do think, we're in a situation where, we'd have to remember that our receipts, and versus expenditures, we're running roughly 6 million, 5 to 6 million in the red every year. So, even a $2 million property tax bump does not close that down. I do think some level of cuts certainly are warranted, but I do think kind of getting into the situation where we can recommend specific levels is probably beyond our capacity in a meeting like today. So I just invite other committee members to weigh in. Maybe they have a different view, but I guess that's kind of where I've landed after looking at some of this.
Well, after several years of it always ended up being worse than what we expected. It's nice to hear some positive news. But yeah, I agree with Ryan that like the way the last couple of years of what they've shown us is that if we're not prepared for the worst, like we're going to get steamrolled. So I don't think the approach that the board has taken to making voluntary cuts the last couple of years, I think that mindset, I hope, continues for sure.
don't disagree with anything that Ryan and Adam have said, but I do feel that your faces all look a lot more glum, really, than maybe it's appropriate. Because that was pretty good news.
And I hope we don't take the foot off of, you know, pressing the state to fully fund Ed Choice too, because you want to talk about ending levy cycles or stretching it out to a record gap. Like, if I don't know if there's any way that this windfall can help take that off our necks, you know, in terms of what the state can do with the money that they have, you know, fund it. You know, if there's a way to work that money where they can fund it, then let's get it funded from the state level, and we don't have to have levy, you know, and that's something that every voter in Cleveland Heights should be, in University Heights should be in favor of, is getting it funded at the state level fully.
Yeah, I don't really disagree with any of the analysis that anybody has. I think that, you know, sort of thinking about it outside of this room, though, is like, what can we do as the Lake Finance Committee, or maybe what can the school do, the district do, to really kind of, to Adam's point, like, make this a public campaign, make it known to the citizen. Like, I don't know legally what we're able to do, or, you know, financially what kind of resources we would be able to commit to something like that. But, you know, what can we do to get citizens in the Heights to, you know, talk to their legislators? Probably not so much that their legislators are opposed to, you know, school funding reform anyway. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's I'm just trying to think of things that we can do outside of this room, where we just kind of we kind of look at the numbers, make recommendations, you know, and we're kind of constrained by these kind of facts. Is there anything, you know, politically or community based, that we are able to do to talk to people about, like, why this is beneficial to the community, you know, why education reform at the state level needs to happen in order for us to be able to, you know, function in the future, you know, and have more sort of reasonable and longer gap, you know, levies that would work for the community.
My personal feeling on this, and from even speaking with districts like Talawanda, who was concerned about Ed Choice as well, I think we need to reach out to our colleagues in the reddest parts of Ohio who are also feeling this, and get them on board and get them to help carry that message to the State House with us. I think there's no other way. I mean, it's clearly obvious that the people in Columbus don't care about districts like ours. But if we start getting the districts that are sending them to Columbus to help advocate with us, that would be very powerful.
You know, we would have had Cup Patterson, which would have basically paid for Ed Choice, would have been paid for out of a separate line item on the state budget, and not come out of our allocation. You know, 90-some% of the House passed it at the end of the last year, and was stuck in the Senate because Matt Dolan, the senator from Chagrin Falls, didn't advance it because he didn't think there was enough public comment on it. We've all testified. We know that lots and lots and lots of people have testified. There's obviously other motives that he had to, you know, put the brakes on it. You know, one person holding up something that over 90% of a bipartisan House thought was okay. So I think the votes are out there for it. But we have to advocate for that. I mean, if we didn't have Ed Choice sucking money away from us, you could almost get away without any school levies. I mean, it's almost gotten to that point. It's $9 million this year.
There are a lot of other organizations that members of this committee could engage with, if they haven't done so already, who I think are doing a very good job of advocating for changes in the method that the state uses for funding schools. Susie Kaiser, of course, is at the forefront of much of that. I don't think that as a committee that it is appropriate for us to join together in that kind of advocacy. We are, after all, a committee of the board, and but I think that there should be no constraints on us as individuals in joining with other groups and advocating politically for more adequate funding for public education. I think we could be talking also generally about the importance of public education, and we see some of the effects of the move away from governmental support of public education. But I do think that it's not something that our committee, I mean, I'm not dictating this, but just saying in my own view, I don't think it's something that our committee can really do or work on as a committee.
Well, I guess I would ask if any of the members had anything else that they wanted to discuss relating to cut recommendations. I mean, I think we've spoken our piece, and our message is that we do think some level of cuts is still necessary, and the work, as Adam said, the work that the board's been doing in that realm is important, and I'm glad to hear that Ms. Kirby and Mr. Gaynor have been sharpening the pencils even this morning. And it's unfortunately probably still necessary, even with the good news. And I'm smiling, Kathy. So just because we are, when you look at those, I smile for a while, then I look at that receipts line, that expenditures line, and there still is quite a gap. So we need to not think that this is, we don't need to do anything. I mean, that's what I was afraid that people would interpret maybe our message as that, and that's not the message. That's not what I believe to be true. So with that, I guess I'd ask the committee if anybody wants to speak further on that topic, or if anybody has additional business. The only other thing I would bring up, and Scott's going to smile when I say this, is I know that he was going to reach out to Mr. Goff about his membership on the committee. Have you heard anything from him? Obviously, I expect he's not going to participate in future meetings, but I guess I would just inquire as to whether you've heard anything.
Yeah, no, I have. He actually is moved out of the district. He did respond that he is no longer on the committee.
So, my view is that we function fine as a committee with one less member. We've been constituted by the board. If the board wants to reconstitute us and add members, I think that could happen at the pleasure of the board. But I see no need to recommend to the board that they need to do that from my perspective. Kathy?
I think that it would be ideal if we had some representation from University Heights. Are any of the current members residents of University Heights or of that little part of South Euclid? I mean, in the past, there used to be somebody from University Heights, and there also used to be, I thought, representatives of the city councils.
So we, to Kathy's point, we'd reached out to the city councils because you're right. We've had, you'll remember Dennis Wilcox was always heavily involved with the Lake Finance Committee. Like, for example, the city of University Heights had Win Weiser. We reached out to them and said, do you want to have someone participate or actively engage with the committee? For a while, it was Win Weiser. And then when we reached out to Mayor Brennan, he actually proposed Mr. Goff because he was not only their city finance director at that time, but was a resident of University Heights. So we had that presentation there from University Heights. South Euclid portion, I'd have to look back on that one.
But I guess the committee has been. Kathy, go ahead.
Question, and that is, do you have people that are asking to be on the committee? Are you getting applications for people that want to be added?
I've had 2 people approach me asking to get on and how to get on. And there's a board policy that outlines how positions are filled in this committee. And there's nothing out right now, looking for more members. And maybe that's a gray area that we have on, how you reconstitute members that have left. I'd like your recommendations on how you would. Do we just open it up again? Would your committee feel comfortable about that?
Well, I think that's the board. It's really the board's role to decide how they want to constitute the committee, and that they might consider if we do have applicants, and and also maybe we need a little bit more diversity in terms of residency, to consider expanding the number of the committee, kicking some of us off. I don't really think. I think we do function well as a committee, and so I would prefer expansion.
So what's a good number of participants?
I don't think there's a magic number. I think 3 people could have a really hard time accomplishing anything. I don't know whether bigger or smaller is better, but I do think that there is. I think that it is unfortunate not to have better geographic representation.
Well, it's hard when you put these applications out, because there's a little vetting that does go through. To make sure that the person who is, applying is actually qualified. And you don't necessarily get them from that little area in South Euclid. And sometimes you don't get them in all the neighborhoods in Cleveland Heights or everywhere in University Heights. And, and there's more to, I guess, geographic diversity. I think there needs to be some race diversity on the committee. I think that's, we have to look at our school district and what it's comprised of and made up of, and you already have a school board that doesn't really look like the kids that we're teaching. So there's, but we are the ones that have been elected by our peers. I guess what would be helpful for me, this is a board committee. There's a process that we go through that actually is run through Liz's office on how the selection is made. But if we go out there, and I do think having the number of people that you have is a little bit probably too small. I almost think the more the merrier in something like this. This is part of a process of us being transparent and getting more eyeballs to look on things, and more public meetings where these things are discussed. And we do value that. But I guess I'd be curious. So if we did put an application process out, my gut is we need more than one person.
Yeah, I don't think this is something where we want it to be constant rolling applications where we're reconstituting. It seems to me we had our application process. I think it was our first meeting, at least on the website, is February 2019. So we've been operating with this group for about 2 years. It would seem like throwing it open, every 2 years is maybe too fast. But ultimately, I really do view these as board decisions. I think we function well right now. I would agree, Jim, with your sentiment that if we added a few members, that would seem to work well to me. If the more the merrier, I would maybe say, I'm not sure I agree with that at some point. If we're getting up to 13 or 15 or 17, I'd probably say it's probably tough to manage. So, I think something in the high single digits is probably about right.
Scott, would it be difficult to go back and sort of look over the last, let's say, 20 years of lay finance committees and how large they were, and whether there's any kind of category of people that seems to be missing? If we were to expand.
Yeah, no, I could absolutely look into that.
I've probably been on.
My sense is this committee is smaller than other lay finance committees that I've served on.
I can probably answer that. I mean, because I think probably for the last 18 years or so, I've been involved in the lay finance committee. And I would say that we've had 7 to 9 people. And usually there were seats that were University Heights would have a seat, Cleveland Heights would have a seat, which is, we already discussed that earlier. And they would just usually bring an elected official in. We've been having joint board meetings, and we have a joint board meeting with Cleveland Heights, University Heights, and the library on in April of this year.
April 12th.
Thank you. And and that's an opportunity for us to share information. I'm not necessarily sure we need those fixed seats. I mean, I think I'm hearing you as far as what needs to be done. I think, you know, because this is a board committee, I'd like to have this conversation with the 5 board members in our next board, in our next board meeting, so we can actually, I guess, talk a little bit more about the makeup and the need. So.
Okay. Well, does anybody have any other business for this committee tonight? Okay, well, Jody, thank you for joining us today and for the presentation. It was very helpful. And thank you, Scott, as always, and Liz, or Ms. Kirby, excuse me. I appreciate your participation tonight as well.
And thank you. Thank you for inviting me to come and present that.
Okay.
All right.
We can adjourn.
Good night.